Educational discourse is shot through with straight lines. They manifest in almost every facet of our practice and our provision, which seems somehow to gravitate towards linear journeys between set milestones or landmarks. The straight line, for instance, inhabits how we think about relationships between learners and the curriculum, in the transmission of content and thinking from an expert to a novice. It underpins our cultural obsession with the objective as a device which establishes a singular path and a singular all-important outcome to a lesson. In turn, we orchestrate sequences of learning as a dot-to-dot of learning outcomes, presuming that foundational understandings must be in place before more sophisticated ones can form. When we think of our learners, we also imagine them on a linear trajectory, following their own straight lines. And these are not just lines in their journey through the curriculum. We are also sensitive to past experiences and how they lead learners to particular understandings or responses, and to developmental milestones encoded in biology or culture. These too operate as linearizing devices, metaphors for thinking which presume straight and predictable lines. And that same sense of the straight line occupies the accountability structures which govern learners, teachers and schools, in which the notion of the target reigns supreme. And with it, a presumption that setting defined goals will lead to a managed progression towards them in learning and in achievement. All of these tendencies point to something in our cultural genetics, something deep down and resonant, which draws us to the linear journey with fixed endpoints and a knowable path. And of course, this way of thinking tends in very general senses to work for us, both in education and in life more generally. But in this film, I'd like to invite the reader to be mischievous, and to consider that this only works because we make it work. That learning, in particular, can be contextualized in layers of straight lines only if we dispense with anything that troubles and contradicts that linearity. In other words, if we obscure those facets which are chaotic and messy and unpredictable. I'd like to suggest that this mess is a natural byproduct of a fundamentally human process, and thus, that in ignoring or eliminating it, we may produce a more manageable process, but also one which is less humane and less profound in its consequences. To arrive at a point where this mess can be part of our pedagogic responses to learning, and not an interference to it, we must first deconstruct deep-set hierarchical and linear ways of thinking. These ways of thinking were culturally established through the Enlightenment era, and embedded in our transition through a modernist outlook. They tend towards conceptualizing history and the history of ideas as a march of progress. They cast knowledge as something cumulative and growing from solid foundations, in which each new innovation builds on what has gone before. They establish a construct of knowledge as hierarchical, foundational, and linear. My argument is that our theories of learning have been shaped in the image of this way of thinking about knowledge, primarily because we habitually think of learning as an immersion in that knowledge. As such, these theories cast learning as predictable responses to stimuli, and as the refinement of one layer of concepts with a layer of more sophisticated ones. They view understanding as a reflection in miniature of the cultural imagining of knowledge, with similar hierarchical and foundational qualities. And they lend themselves to pedagogies which shape these structures in linear and predictable ways. But I would suggest that through their attempts to tame learning, these pedagogies also serve to dull it. For me, there is a dynamism to learning in its untamed form. It is an explosive chaos which is replete with potential energy. It must necessarily have a starting point, but in its unravelling, any number of interconnections and directions of travel might emerge. We seek often to harness this chaos. Like the internal combustion engine, we try to capture its energy, to direct it in a single trajectory. But the engine wastes much of this potential energy, as sound and as heat lost through friction and lack of insulation, and perhaps we do the same. It also leads us to view our learners in particular ways, to reduce them to cognitive responses to our guidance and our stimuli. It dispenses with the messy fringes of human beings, Fascinations and obsessions, fears and passions and distractions and impulses become interferences in the learning process, dispensed with as tangential to the focal concern. Here too, a form of potential energy is lost, as is a little of the humanity which inheres to the classroom. In understanding my own impulses in this area, and in trying to imagine an alternative, Delueze and Guattari have been particularly useful. Much of their work seeks to disrupt habits of thinking by introducing new metaphors and concepts. They note, for instance, a Western tendency towards arborescence. We think of things as trees, organised into fixed hierarchies which can be traced back to singular origins. This is an image reflected in the modernist construction of knowledge, and its corresponding theories of learning and pedagogy. To disrupt these habits, Delueze and Guattari invite their readers to introduce the metaphor of the rhizome into their thinking. A rhizome is a kind of root system found in plants such as ginger and Japanese knotweed, which has a number of features which contrast with tree hierarchies. They are twisty, networked and non-linear phenomena, rather than being singular and hierarchical. It is these shifts which Delueze and Guattari suggest can underpin interesting new ways of thinking about the social world, and which I would suggest can provoke interesting reconceptualizations of learning. The rhizome resists the sense that things have fixed and traceable beginnings. Rather, any point of a rhizomatic root system, if broken and planted somewhere else, will grow and evolve into a new plant. As such, whilst the tree metaphor leads towards thinking of foundational concepts in learning, and curriculum and pedagogy which focuses on the importance of beginning with prerequisite concepts, that of the rhizome suggests something very different. It is actively anti-foundational. It suggests that learning can begin with any given concept and proceed wherever experimentation with that concept leads. This raises a second of Delueze and Guattari's observations on the rhizome, that such structures are not pre-programmed reflections of their genetics. Rather, their shapes and structures relate to the soil in which they grow. They twist and turn to avoid stones, spread quickly through loose soil, and are hindered by that which is compacted. The resultant physical structure reflects more on the context in which the rhizome exists than it does the inherent qualities of the plant. This again might be applied to learning, where the emphasis becomes the ways in which learners put ideas to use in understanding their lived context better. In thinking in these ways, singular concepts and preferred ways of arranging these concepts become meaningless. Rather, ideas are situated as constantly shifting networks and relationships, with disparate ideas brought together in ways which create useful sense. I think this is a way of thinking about learning that attends more closely to its explosive and productively chaotic natures, and offers to harness far more of its potential energies. In doing so, it creates provocation for really interesting new thinking on what pedagogy looks like and what it intends to support. It also frames up new ways of thinking about other relatively contemporary turns in educational theory. To name but three, it offers further depth to advocates of what is broadly called critical pedagogy, approaches which call for the learner's world of experience to be drawn into educational processes in meaningful ways. It connects to the resurgence of a focus on classroom talk, which calls for open and extended dialogic processes in order to allow learners to co-construct positions and understandings in relation to external concepts and ideas. And it talks in interesting ways about the impacts and potentials of new digital technologies, and in particular, how pedagogy can embrace their networked and disruptive ways of representing knowledge. Of course, it would be disingenuous to end a film which embraces the rhizome with a fully worked and articulated version of either the pedagogies they can spawn or the interconnections with theory they offer. Rather, I leave this challenge to the listener, that they might grab a concept or a notion posed here and put it to work in their own contexts, to see simply what grows.